Believe it or not, I am trying to speed up how quickly I make videos. Uploading every 50-something days is a bit long. This video was plagued with random issues, not the least of which being that this movie stopped being free on YouTube the literal day I decided to start recording clips. So sorry that each clip is a different resolution and frame rate. Still, I think the delay might have been helpful. It's occurred to me recently that, while I focus on writing, it might give the wrong impression on how I feel about various media. After all, a movie or series or game or stage play isn't just the script, it's the acting, it's the visuals, it's the sound, all working with the writing to create a unified experience. I say this because I can very easily like something that isn't well written. Now, I'd prefer things to be well written, but sometimes the other factors can be strong enough to elevate a mediocre script. I think today's topic of the 2009 Star Trek movie is a great example of that. In the spirit of my new understanding, I'm going to do something I never thought I would do. Most of this video is still dedicated to breaking down the writing, but I'll start with a section dedicated to everything that isn't the writing. Visually, this movie has aged pretty well. My only real complaint is one I have no doubt you've heard before, and probably saw for yourself if you've watched the movie. Yes, the lens flares are out of control. But if you can ignore the constant flashing, the ship looks good, the uniforms look good, the alien world looks good, and so on. It's clear a lot of effort and planning went into making things really feel like it's a futuristic progression of things familiar to us, instead of going straight into the wacky zone. As much as I like the visuals, I think the sound is even better. It's an odd sentence to say, but this is the best sounding movie I can think of. The obvious reason is the soundtrack. Genuinely fantastic work capturing the grand, optimistic, and heroic feel of the original theme and world. Outside of the music, the rest of the sound is sublime as well. I love the sounds of the echoing pings, the communications tone, the weapons, and various ship alarms. Special shout out to the Enterprise's engine sound. It has the eerie tone of some old civil defense sirens. All of that, combined with good action sequences, make this movie fun to watch. I would even go as far as to say that I like this movie. So please keep that in mind while I talk about the writing, which will be mostly negative. The opening scene is actually good. I know someone has already picked up a pitchfork, but please let me explain. Yes, I know that in the canon Kirk's father does not die here. Yes, I'm fully aware of the downfalls of adding time travel where it doesn't belong. There's a section of this very video that will talk about it. Yes, I know Star Trek has done time travel before, I just can't get into that right now. Think about it like this. Before this movie, Star Trek didn't have any audiovisual media since 2005. Sure, that's only 4 years between the end of Star Trek Enterprise and this movie, but that series is not usually what general audience think of when they hear Star Trek. So considering that this is a reboot of the original series with Captain Kirk and was slated for actual theater showings, they needed an opening scene that really grabs hold of these potential fans who aren't pre-existing Trekkies. I'll discuss whether or not it was necessary to undo the lore later in the video. And what a scene to start with. Shows us a ship, shows us a captain, shows us a situation, and shows us a villain. We have action that immediately establishes how high the stakes are by demonstrating that the movie will not hesitate to kill people. Now the audience knows that the invite for the captain to negotiate will probably not end well. When it doesn't, it makes sense. Characterization is done quite well in this scene. George is a more than competent leader, even when under the heartbreaking stress of knowing that his wife is about to give birth to a son he will never meet. That son, of course, is James T. Kirk. People, this is how you do an opening. It's a shame that this is where it all starts to go downhill. The scene that follows really sets the tone for what a lot of my criticisms about this movie boil down to. Is this really the best way they could have done this? Here's the thing. I know what they're trying to do in this scene, as well as the Spock equivalent scene next. They want to introduce this movie's take on these two legendary characters. Now, the car chase scene technically works. Kirk is still a wild card, but he's not yet interested in Starfleet because now he doesn't have a father to inspire him. But is this not information we could have gotten from the bar fight scene just a few minutes later? In fact, between the car chase and the bar fight scenes is Spock's introduction, which does pretty much the same thing. Shows a kid and then pre-Starfleet Spock negatively reacting to insinuations about his mother's heritage. Once again, it works, but I question if it really is the best way to go about it. Let's workshop these scenes. Cut the car chase, cut the school scene. We start here, with Spock having this moment with his mother. We already name-dropped Kirk as a baby, we can build some anticipation just by waiting. We see his deep affection for her and how he does have some emotional baggage. Then the Academy acceptance scene can continue pretty much as it already does. Now let's say it is after this outburst that Spock doesn't want to hurt his mother's feelings, so he doesn't tell her what happened. He has the conversation with his father, and that hints that he will join Starfleet. Next, we can go into the bar fight scene, but here's the catch. Let's say Kirk is already a cadet. I know, people who really like this movie probably don't like that, especially since Pike says a great line in this scene, but we don't have to lose that. The way the scene plays out right now feels too coincidental. Pike's dialogue even seems to reference it. I think the scene should go like this. Kirk is a cadet in uniform at the bar with his future classmates. In the original canon, Kirk joined Starfleet because his father inspired him. Now he's following the footsteps of his mother. He's just as cocky, but it's because his dad died a hero, and we can tap into the resentment he already has in this movie. We can even have him enter with Bones so that they don't have to shoehorn him as hard as they end up doing later. Everything plays out similarly, but when Pike stops the fight, he emphasizes that Kirk's father didn't save everyone for selfish glory, but out of selfless sacrifice. Make Kirk question his resentment towards his father. You could even tie in that Kirk thinks he will be a better captain than his father because he doesn't think he will fall into the same fate, and Pike's line could be setting the tone for what being a captain really means. Then we can do our Nero sneak peek and cut to the Academy like it already does. Ignoring the aforementioned Nero scene and the time travel issues with this movie for now, as I said earlier, I'll get to them, I think my proposed edits still show everything we need to understand our two main characters, but in a far less convoluted way. We don't retread anything we already know, and the flow is improved by removing unnecessary time skips. Alright, next we have Kirk talking to Bones about taking the Kobayashi Maru test again. This scene is very brief and does nothing but exposit a tiny amount about the test and have Bones set up a joke about Kirk's studying. The study scene is another one that technically works, but in the most roundabout way possible. In fact, the only useful thing this scene does is only in this movie because of the chaotic plot structure this movie is going to ram straight into a few scenes from now. Kirk overhears Uhura say this.
Strangest thing. I was in the long-range sensor lab.
Yeah, I thought all night.
I was tracking solar systems and I picked up an emergency transmission.
Really?
Yeah. From a Klingon prison planet.
No.
Yeah. A Klingon armada was destroyed. 47 ships.
So you're not going back to the lab tonight?
And that right there is going to save the Enterprise later on. Here's a tip. Never write something important in a line of dialogue like this. This scene is structured in a way that the main tension is rooted in the audience wondering how Kirk is getting out of this situation. Typically, the dialogue that would appear in this situation is just filler to make the scene feel more natural until the tension is relieved and the character is allowed to move to the next step. Applied to this movie, anything Uhura says while she doesn't know Kirk is in the room would naturally not be considered important until she directly acknowledges Kirk's presence. Helping that interpretation is the fact that her volume is low and the camera focuses still either on Kirk or from Kirk's point of view. Even the interaction is only using the earlier information as support for the humor. In other words, it is total BS when this becomes the key to Kirk suddenly understanding the situation later, but I'll get to that when I get there. For now, just remember this scene. The Kobayashi Maru scene is surprisingly an accurate callback while also not. Kind of like the rest of this movie now that I think about it. Niche details are correct, but the execution is a mess. Anyway, like the original Kirk, this Kirk reprograms the test to make winning possible. Unlike the original Kirk, he does not get a commendation for original thinking. Instead, he apparently gets brought before an academic court? I mean, I guess this would be like getting court-martialed, but these movies try to emphasize that Starfleet is not military, and these are cadets in training. I don't get why the school would do a hearing like this. Surely they would just call him into a private office somewhere with the school representatives for a private session, and apparently Spock is also there. Instead of nitpicking the scene, let's just keep moving because there are more interesting points I want to get to. Cadets are assigned ships, they go to their ships. Listen, it's inefficient, but the scene works well enough that I'm going to just keep moving. What I want to focus on here is that Kirk is on academic probation and is barred from going to a ship. Bones gives him some allergic reactions to scam him onto the ship with some nonsensical regulations, and now he's sick. Kirk is on the Enterprise. And this is where that study scene's mishandling collides with all of the other common mistakes of this movie into one colossal mess. Kirk, currently ailing from all of Bones' vaccines, hears the mission briefing, remembers that line I guarantee most of the audience never heard the first time, connects it with what happened to his dad, and convinces Uhura even though his speech is impaired and she's distracted by his hands, and they convince Pike. Somehow, he's even right. Where do I even start with this? I believe that what happened in the writing process of this particular sequence of events is basically a forced completion of an idea. The Vulcan scenes are coming up, and they needed a way to go from Starfleet punishing Kirk for how he operates to Starfleet recognizing they need Kirk because of the way he operates. But they took the messiest path possible. In order for me to workshop this, I need to go on a tangent about training. I have no idea how Starfleet conducts its training. Maybe it's described somewhere else in the lore, I don't know. All I do know is that Starfleet is not military, so even though this looks like some variation of officer school, it's apparently something else. The issue is, there is no defined position for most of the people in this scene. For example, Kirk was taking the Kobayashi Maru, which appears to involve training for the role of captain. Yet he's still just a cadet. After all, he seems to be in the same class as Uhura, and she's definitely a cadet, and yet she's not taking the Kobayashi Maru. I mean, she probably is being evaluated too, but she's not in the captain's chair. I can't figure the system out. Anyway, the emergency Nero causes make Starfleet take their not yet graduated cadets and puts them in ships to respond. Clearly, this implies that the situation is more important than academic status, and by extension, Kirk's academic probation. Kirk cheating on the Kobayashi Maru is only important enough to keep him off the ship if he is unable to perform any other function on the ship. You may be wondering why I'm banging on about this. My point is, some effort should have been made to at least look at commercial shipping in real life. Nobody is trained to be in command, and their first job is captain. Most captains get their captain's license early, but they still have to work other positions on ships in order to finally qualify. It's readily believable that they would demote Kirk as punishment, but I can still see them putting him on the Enterprise in some other role. The whole handbrake thing can still happen, and the Enterprise just be late enough to dodge immediate destruction. I mean, I don't know how much Kirk's warning changed this situation and how it plays out. I can totally see the ship getting as damaged as it is, Nero recognizing that it is the Enterprise doing the fake parlay and all that. Except now Kirk is actually needed on the ship, and he's not there out of what is functionally a coincidence. Moving on, Pike gets captured and now there's an action sequence on the drill. It's fine. I have no complaints. The red shirt joke is actually a nice touch in my opinion because it doesn't call attention to the fact, but instead just lets it play out. Even the destruction of Vulcan is fine in my opinion. Some might complain because it's another departure from the canon, but considering everything else this movie is doing, at least the scene works. I don't start banging my head on my desk again until the next convoluted sequence of events. And again, I have mixed feelings. Seeing Leonard Nimoy as Spock again is nice, but on a writing level, this whole scene is another example of the same problems this movie is trapped in. I'm still saving time travel for later, but that still leaves us with unexplainable coincidences and Starfleet being unable to make decisions that make practical sense. I'll do the Starfleet one first. So, Pike named Spock acting captain and Kirk as first officer. Pike is captured, so Spock is undoubtedly in charge. He argues with Kirk and then banishes him. Now, people seem to shuffle positions on the ship all the time. Every time someone leaves, they assign someone to fill that role, and therefore no role is ever left empty. When all of this is over, and Kirk returns to the Enterprise, why does his plan work? Spock, The one person on this ship who actually seems to try to follow the regulations didn't assign a new first officer after booting Kirk out? Plus, someone who is exiled off the ship is still eligible to take command? It's not pointless of me to criticize writing Starfleet like this. The story the movie is trying to tell requires the audience to see Kirk as really clever. Yet the way events are orchestrated don't build up Kirk's cleverness as much as it makes Starfleet a weak target for Kirk's antics. As far as the coincidences go, once again we have a new version of a legacy character meeting Kirk for the first time. So, Scotty is apparently stationed at this outpost with one other person because he beamed an Admiral's dog that apparently Kirk knew in a way that it went missing. And it happens to be the outpost Kirk is also banished to after he's booted from the Enterprise. I can usually overlook the occasional coincidence in a story. I shouldn't, but hey, sometimes a piece of media can lower your standards. The main problem here is that this kind of stacked coincidence completely kills the vastness of the Star Trek universe this movie's trying to create. How is the audience supposed to get the impression that space is big when apparently everyone knows each other? And their dog.
Well, I know that dog.
Anyway, with Kirk now in charge and the Enterprise re-engaging, I'm going to skip pretty far ahead. Remember, I'm here to talk about writing stuff, and the action scenes are not terrible in that sense. I have a gripe about Kirk opening fire and almost killing everyone on his own ship when it was already clear Nero was going to die, but it's not worth spending too much time on. My only comment about it is that it is an unnecessary increase in tension. You might be confused because adding tension is pretty much always said as a good thing, and yeah, it generally is. Like a lot of things in this movie, we're dealing with the exception. I'll put it like this. Always increase tension as you approach the climax. Defeating Nero is the climax. Generally, the audience gets to ride the high of the climatic victory as the story relaxes itself into a debrief moment with the characters and then the final image. Adding this random moment of tension just kills the feeling of victory and replaces it with a hollow relief that is considerably weaker. Speaking of the debrief, I'm okay with the conversation between the two Spocks. Don't get me wrong, this scene only exists because the entire movie before it has tripped over itself so much that two versions of the same character have now bumped into one another. But all things considered, I like original Spock's words of wisdom. It's time to address the time-traveling elephant in the room. The reason I've waited until now to discuss the time travel aspect is because it is the driving force of the plot as well as the root cause of all the problems that plague the movie. To really fix this movie, the time travel has to be removed, but that essentially guts the movie to nothing. Time travel tends to be like that in fiction, which is why it's viciously discouraged by every writer I know. I plan on making a dedicated video about time travel in fiction at some point, but for now, the basic thoughts you need for context are that time travel can be used effectively in fiction if the world is specifically built for it, and that adding time travel to a world that wasn't built for it is a very bad idea. Now, I am aware that time travel has been used in Star Trek before, so you can go ahead and put your pitchforks down. And then you can pick them back up because I think that was a mistake as well. Yes, there were funny scenes, but I wholeheartedly believe it's one of the weaker Star Trek stories. And yet, it is better than the 2009 movie. Let's look at the reasoning behind why this movie is the way it is. Creators wanted a new Star Trek thing that looked better and was more exciting than Star Trek was traditionally known for. After all, this is before nerd stuff became cool, so they have to turn the nerd stuff cool if it is going to appeal to the mainstream audiences. Now, a departure like that is probably going to stir some contempt from the people who are already fans. They are fans because they liked the stuff that came before. Change too much and it won't be the same. The balance then must be nostalgic enough to appease the already existing fanbase, but shiny enough to bring in new fans. Now, this can be done. The easiest way is to write new characters to populate a new ship and start a new branch of the canon. There's your new stuff. Then, to appease the nostalgic groups, write your stories to aim at the ideas Star Trek was pointed toward anyway. You know, exploration, wonder, optimism for a future based on cooperation, that kind of thing. There is enough space in the timeline that they could even make it take place between the original series and the Next Generation if they wanted. Instead, they elected to try and reuse characters that are already well known. Specifically, they even wanted to do an origin story of sorts. Now, cornering yourself like that is already a bad idea as a writer, but at least with the right amount of research, you can get something that fits. After all, breaking the canon you're trying to do an origin story for is going to tick off the pre-existing fan base, which would be a poor financial decision. As such, your creative freedom has been dampened because there's only one direction your story can go. Literally the opening of whatever it is it's based on. Therefore, I predict this is where the time travel idea came up. Maybe I'm wrong, but to me, this makes the most sense. They want younger versions of beloved characters, and they want room to reference famous scenes from old Star Trek, but they don't want to be bound to the canon. They want to eat their cake and have it too. Thus, time travel. The way time travel is handled in this movie causes way more problems than I imagine are worth dealing with. So Spock and Nero go through the wormhole thing and end up in the past. Nero ends up 25 years further in the past, and then just sits around waiting for Spock, and he doesn't try to go back to Romulus, which exists again in his point of view. I mean, yeah, he still doesn't have his family, he would probably have to fake his identity, but I feel like someone in this situation would try to save his home planet instead of do some convoluted revenge plan on the guy who was too late saving it for the first time. It's not like Spock destroyed Romulus himself. He really tried to save it. He was just late. And it's not like this is some canon event type stuff where Romulus has to be destroyed because the timeline is already confirmed to be altered because of this event, and Nero even destroys Vulcan. If destroying a planet is fine, why is saving your own not? The whole thing about trying to explain the ways these legacy characters met is also unnecessary. Starfleet is a big organization. We didn't need to know how they all met before because we could simply infer that they were simply assigned together. Trying to explain these tiny background details about characters that are now on a fundamentally different path than the original canon is completely pointless. If you're not going to use the characters in their original context, why even bother wrestling with minutia that explains their old dynamics? Like I said before, it's hard to suggest removing time travel from this movie because that implies the entire movie needs to be rewritten from the ground up. Yet, I'm convinced that would have led to a much better Star Trek movie that would have gone down better with everyone. That's not to say this movie is completely hated, as there are plenty of people who love it and its sequels. Even I enjoy watching them. But when looked at critically, I think it is important to see this movie as a case study of what happens when you try to do too many things at once while trying to appease two different audiences. Sometimes, you have to let go of your original idea to make room for a better one. Making sacrifices is a part of writing stories, and when writers try to avoid letting go of anything, it only leads to convoluted plots which do a million things and yet few of them are done well. I'll see you all next time.